Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our fifth session of the American Scripture Project. Just a reminder that the American Scripture Project is a pilot program uh, for what will hopefully be a really much longer and beautiful curriculum that is currently being developed and which has the internal purpose of hopefully raising consciousness of uh, different ways of thinking about American identity and Jewish identity, the intersection of those. And I believe that the rabbi who is preparing them, Rabbi Michael Holtzman, really sees it as part of his mission to um, change the standards of discourse, like to really allow people a new skill in how to have a kind of discourse around American democracy. Um, and I think that's really cool. But the reason why I wanted to do it is because it sort of felt like here was an opportunity to engage with texts, scripture of the American canon, and to treat them like we treat Jewish texts of the Jewish canon, and to really pull them apart and to try to understand what is motivating them and how they fit into our life. And that, to me, I had hoped would fit the broader theme of people of the books, because we're a literary culture, and I hope that looking at these different texts would really help us to clarify like the ways in which Jews look at literature kind of differently, or uh, or at least to use our Jewish lenses to approach these topics. I have found that I have been um, that some of them have been more successful than others, and uh, but I'm really looking forward to our last two sessions, the tonight's session on the Sojourner Truth speech, and next month's session on um and next month's session on the ones who walked away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin, which is a very short story, a short story that I first encountered when I was in high school. I think it was published in 1973. So it has. So anyway, I we're gonna look at that next time. I did sort of feel that Sojourner Truth had a lot of resonances with the holiday of Purim, which we just celebrated, and that the ones who walk away from Omelas has a lot of resonances with Pesach, which we'll look at it right before Pesach. And so I think there's some that's kind of fun to me. Um, so I will be very candid in telling you that I didn't know a lot about Sojourner Truth at all before studying for this class. And of course, I knew the name, but if you had just said, from what part of history was Sojourner Truth, I don't know that I would have been able to pinpoint her exact decades. I probably would have wondered whether she was before or after the Civil War, and what her and but I knew that she was uh an abolitionist and an advocate for suffrage. One thing that's sort of interesting uh about American history is, and we've discussed this a little bit, there's a promise of some kind of um, freedom for all, some kind of um, equality. In the American sort of ethos, there's a promise of equality, and yet the denial of suffrage, meaning votes for women, and the denial of not just suffrage, the denial of suffrage, meaning the right to vote for both women and enslaved people or formerly enslaved people. Uh, that that's a huge piece, and it wasn't just suffrage; it was also other rights, and it remains something that we struggle with to this day in our country. America has always been a country of outsized personalities. In many ways, our public figures, our celebrities, they kind of take the place of the way that royalty were treated in Europe. Uh, but by the way, I just got finished reading a nine book. This is completely a tangent, so you'll have to apologize. I apologize for the tangent, but I just finished reading a nine novel long retelling of the Napoleonic Wars, the first Napoleonic Wars, um, in a fantastical setting that includes dragons. So it's like, imagine that each nation had like dragons and a dragon breeding program and an aerial corps that included fighters who fight on dragon back. Okay. And then like and then put that into the setting of the Napoleonic Wars. And it was nine novels long. It was really fun by Naomi Novik, whose more recent books I think are uh, might be particularly relevant to folks here because she's Jewish and she uses a lot of Jewish themes in her more recent books, especially Spinning Silver, um, which is a retelling of Rumpelstiltskin. Um, but of course, Rumpelstiltskin is a profoundly anti-Semitic trope, and she like addresses that right away. Obviously, he's like this goblinoid figure who has a long nose and an obsession with money and a weird, hard to pronounce name. It's very clear that he represents the Jewish people. Anyway, oh yeah, and he steals your kids. That's like part of the whole ethos. Whatever. This is not a class about Rumpelstiltskin. Anyway, you should absolutely read Naomi Novik's books if you like novels that are sort of fantastical, but also set in sort of retellings of real world places, which is kind of a cool. She does kind of a mixing of genre there. Anyway, I mentioned it because of this way of treating royalty in the old world that there was like a whole uh way that society was structured around around the royalty, and in some ways we have sort of transferred some of that passion onto our public figures and celebrities. So Sojourner Truth was a celebrity of that kind, and she had a public identity, and she had people who told stories about her. She herself couldn't read or write, and therefore, she did not have as much of a role in shaping her um, legacy as some folks who could read and write did. Frederick Douglass, same time period, was able uh, to shape his own legacy through his writing. But Sojourner Truth was she was an influencer before there were influencers. If we had had social media in the time of Sojourner Truth, we would have all of this records of her speeches and her and the way that she talked just directly to people. Um, a person's image can be shaped and modified, can be elevated or distorted uh, Sojourner Truth and the speech, the famous speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" That speech, uh, that speech, it turns out, has been deeply remembered, and I think deliberately so, um, in order to create a different kind of image of who Sojourner Truth was. So we actually have two written records of the speech. One is from 1851, like very soon after the speech was written, and it's a record written by one of her friends in a Black abolitionist newspaper. Okay. Uh, there is reason to assume that that is a faithful retelling of that speech, as faithful as any retelling of a speech can be. And then there we have the most famous one, which was published in 1863, I mean, more than a decade after the speech was given, and which completely rewrites the whole speech, remembers it in a different dialect and with different words. The main point, I think, remains the same. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about whether it's possible for the main point to remain the same when the presentation is so drastically different, or whether your takeaways from the two presentations are so dissimilar because of the form that the content is also altered. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Um, and we're going to explore sort of the moral implications of that kind of image modification. So we're gonna do this by looking at two different transcriptions of the speech. In the abolitionists version, which becomes the better known, the one from 1863, we can see how cultural norms were applied to the speech patterns and life experiences of formerly enslaved folks. Um, Exploring the two versions will help us see kind of a level of complex dynamics that shaped a piece of American scripture, and I think potentially still influences American identity. Now, so that's what we're going to look at, and we're going to really dive into these two versions. So, first of all, before we start, does anyone uh have anything that they'd like to say about Sojourner Truth, or about your, relationship to this speech, and when did you first hear it, and how does it figure in your understanding of American history? Yeah, Mishka.
I don't think I've ever heard the whole speech. I think I learned about Sojourner Truth as a person, um, probably at some point in high school history, but I don't have any memory that I ever heard or read her speech or anything about her beyond sort of what you were saying. She was um, a former black slave and an abolitionist and a fighter for women's rights.
I
That's what.
never thought as a pediatrician that I would be a
Sorry. Um, Maybe what we should do is, in fact, listen to the speeches, the two versions. I have recordings of the two versions, and then we'll go through the text. But before we do that, does somebody else have a comment?
Edith, you're muted.
Yeah, I realized that. Um, yeah, it was, I also had not really, I knew the name and, that she was an abolitionist. Um, but I guess my shock was, about 4 months ago, going to a concert and seeing, um, right in front of me. On the other side of the street is the statue of Sojourner Truth, and it was sort of like, huh? And what is a statue of Sojourner Truth doing in Florence, Massachusetts? And turns out that she had lived in one of these 19th century communities for several years in this area. And great surprise. And particularly since the building right across the street where I went was a congregational church, but is also a Jewish synagogue on Saturdays. So a very interesting area to be living in, to say the least.
Yeah. Edith sent me this really wonderful article from Smithsonian Magazine about Sojourner Truth that also deals with some of the issues we're going to be talking about tonight. And I really appreciated having that opportunity to engage. All right, so let's start by listening to the more famous version of the speech. That is the 1863 version written by the abolitionist, which, if you've heard any of the speech, you've probably heard this version. All right.
Abolitionist Sojourner Truth, who was herself freed from slavery in 1827, speaks to a gathering of feminists in Akron, Ohio in 1851.
Well, children, where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North, all talking about rights, the white man will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages, lifted over ditches, and to have the best place everywhere. Huh. Nobody ever helps me into carriages, or over mud puddles, or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in the head. What's this they call it? Intellect. That's right, honey. Well, what's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man there in the black, he says women can't have much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Well, where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they's asking to do it. The men better let them.
Master of Realms is a powerful 3D map-making application with just a few strokes of the brush.
Before we watch the next one, does anyone have any comments?
Yeah, I'll just My only thought was that as much as it appeals to modern sensibilities, some of the language twists that she gave it, just rhythm, were kind of, I thought, well,
May I say?
no, you may not. Anyway, we're giving it a modern little twist that I thought, I think that's more of a modern linguistic turn than, I'm not sure that that's really how, anyway, it was certainly just interpreting linguistically through the modern lens a little bit more than what I've heard in some other renditions of it. But it was really good to hear the whole speech. I had forgotten.
Yeah, so that's the 1863 version, and you're absolutely right that the version of the 1863 version that she read, it is a slightly made more easily understood in modern vernacular version of the 1863 version, but it preserves and when we look at it, we'll read the original text of that speech. It does seem clear that from a historical perspective, that Sojourner Truth never said those words, "Ain't I a woman?" And that the original speech, in fact, sounded nothing like what you imagine it sounding like. So let's listen to the speech, the 1851 version that was written in the newspaper right after the speech came out. It's also somebody reading it.
May I say a few words? I want to say a few words about this matter. I am a woman's rights. I have as much muscle as any man, and I can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed. And can any man do better than that? I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man, and I can eat as much too, if I can get it. I am as strong as any man that is today. As for intellect, all I can say is, if a woman have a pint and a man a quart, why can't she have her little pint full? You need not be afraid to give us our rights, for fear we will take too much, for we can't take much more than a pint will hold. The poor men seem to be all in confusion, and they don't know what to do. Why, children, if you have woman's rights, give it to her, and you will feel better. You have your own rights, and there won't be so much trouble. I can't read, but I can hear, and I have heard the Bible and learned that Eve caused man to sin. But if woman upset the world, to give her a chance to set it right side up again. The lady has spoken about Jesus, how he never spurned woman from him, and she was right. When Lazarus died, Mary and Martha came to him with faith and love and besought him to raise their brother. And Jesus wept, and Lazarus came forth. And how came Jesus into the world? Through God who created him, and woman who bore him. Man, where is your part? But women are coming up. Blessed be God, and a few of the men are coming up with him. But man is in a tight place. The poor slave is on him. The women are coming on him, and he is surely between a hawk and a buzzard.
So that was a reading of the 1851 original version of the speech that was put in the abolitionist newspaper. You can see that the main thrust's very similar, but the presentation very different. So does anyone have any comments?
I just have a question. What were the last words? I was having trouble understanding. Something between a hawk and a buzzard or something like that?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
All right, so let's jump into to this um to looking at the two speeches. Here we go. In 1851, roughly a month after Sojourner Truth delivered this famous speech, her friend Marius Robinson reported it in his abolitionist newspaper, the Anti-Slavery Bugle. Robinson introduced his version by setting the scene. One of the most unique and interesting speeches of the convention was made by Sojourner Truth, an emancipated slave. It is impossible to transfer it to paper or convey any adequate idea of the effect it produced upon the audience. Those only can appreciate it who saw her powerful form, her whole-souled, earnest gesture, and listened to her strong and truthful tones. She came forward to the platform and, addressing the president, said with great simplicity, that's how he introduced it. However, the most widely quoted version of this famous speech was written and published in 1863 by Frances Dana Barker Gage, a white abolitionist and women's rights activist who had presided over the convention where Truth delivered the speech. The version of the speech, this is the version of the speech that people reference today, the one actors have performed. According to the Sojourner Truth Project, a website dedicated to preserving the two versions of the speech, Truth, unable to read or write, could not offer her own rhetoric in a written form. Her words as we read them today are not her words, but a representation of her words by people who transcribed them. So neither of them are really what she said. So here we'll compare and contrast. The 1851 version says, "May I say a few words? I want to say a few words about this matter. I am a woman's rights." And the 1863 version says, "Well, chillin', what dar's so much racket, dar must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the niggers of the South and the women of the North, and all a talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon." So you can see right away that the version of the 1863 version was exactly as exactly as Martha said, was a little bit sanitized and brought up to date, but it still maintained its sort of black slave African dialect. I would just say about that Sojourner Truth was a New Yorker who never lived in the American South. And so it seems very unlikely that she would have spoken that way. In fact, her first language was Dutch, since she grew up in a Dutch-speaking family. She was first enslaved by a Dutch-speaking family in New Paltz, which was still very much Dutch, since this part of the world was first settled by the Dutch, and it was New Amsterdam before it was New York. All right, so the one question is, how would these different versions of content and style influence your listening to the speeches?
I think in part it would have depended upon which one I heard first. And how they were how they were spoken. And knowing, for want of a better word, the tagline, "Ain't I a Woman?" how that affected my listening to it. And, it asks here the style influence. I don't know how to answer that. I just don't.
So I was thinking, until I heard the original, the 1851, or the one that's supposed to be closer to what she said, I think all I'd ever heard was the 1863 version.
Yeah, that's the version that everyone knows.
Yep. And it rang true for me when I heard it. But once I heard the 1851 one, then it was kind of like, oh, that influenced my listening. Now I'm kind of like, I'll never hear that 1863 version the same again. And it doesn't have that ring of truth for me that it originally did.
Did anyone else have that experience, or was most folks sort of less familiar with either version that it didn't have that kind of a surprise to it?
A surprise that we had different responses to it?
No, a surprise that the 1851 version of the speech was so different in tone and style.
Well, with the style, I wondered about just the women who were reading it. I wondered, the woman reading the 1851 version, about her accent. Is that her native way of speaking English? Or did she try to make it sound differently, thinking Dutch was behind it? I could not, and I'm usually pretty good at recognizing accents, couldn't place this one at all.
Yes, I wondered that too. I wondered whether the actor that they hired to read the second one came from this website, this project that's trying to preserve the original text, or what's closer to the original text of the speech. They definitely know that her first language was Dutch. And I did wonder, in listening to that recording, whether they had hired an actor who could mimic the way that a native Dutch speaker would be speaking English, or whether that was just the actor herself, that's how she speaks. I don't know.
I took it as the 1863 version being a stereotypical representation of what you would expect to hear from a Black woman that was a former slave.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly the case. Exactly the case. I think that's right. I think that part of the reason why that one retains its power and its place in the canon is because we all walk around with this like little set of assumptions about what a formerly owned person in the mid 19th century must have sounded like.
Mhm.
and what dialect they must have used. So the 1851 version, later in that version, Truth says, the poor men seem to be all in confusion and don't know what to do. Why, children, if you have women's rights, give it to her and you will feel better. You will have your own rights and they won't be so much trouble. So one question that we have is this an effective argument for women's rights?
Hmm.
So think about that. And then the other question is, how does it compare to Gage's version? And you can see here, right, when Gage remembers what Sojourner Truth said, 12 years later, Gage moves that description of how white men will react to the demands for equal rights to the opening of the speech. And she says, right, that version says, casts the speech immediately in opposition to the white men who will be in a fix soon. Gage did that intentionally, right? Like, or maybe unintentionally. When Gage was remembering this speech, right? That was how he remembered it starting. Or maybe he intentionally moved that to the front to make a political point in 1863 in the middle of the war. But also, he was a white man who clearly was an abolitionist, but it's very different from a black abolitionist journalist who owned a newspaper.
Which in itself is pretty amazing.
I actually did a little research on that. I think there were like 40 or 50 different abolitionist newspapers owned by black people in the in the mid 19th century. It was there.
Whoa.
I mean, newspapers were different then. Like, there was a time when newspapers came out twice a day, not in the 1850s, a little later than that. But you know, um, but print newsprint was like how people got all of their information. It was, this before radio, before, yeah. So there were a lot of different newspapers. Also, by the way, like a ton of different Yiddish newspapers. Now we just have the Forward, which doesn't write anything in Yiddish anymore. Um, but there were dozens of Yiddish newspapers.
Hmm.
It's hard to imagine. I mean, I find it hard to imagine, but like what that must have been like. All right, let's look at the next section of the speech. I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed. And can any man do more than that? I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man and can eat as much too if I can get it. I'm as strong as any man that is now. And the more famous version of the speech says, but what's all this here talking about? That man over there say that women needs to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into the carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And aren't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could heed me. And aren't I a woman? I could work as much as eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And aren't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen them most all sold off into slavery. And when I cried out with a mother's grief, none but Jesus heard. And aren't I a woman? So the question here is, which version makes the better case for equality?
I think the 63 version does. Adding to what was ostensibly in the 1851 version, that nobody's ever helped her do the things that one might otherwise do for a white woman or somebody of more wealth, and of course having born children makes her argument or makes the argument stronger in the 1863 version. How much she actually said, we don't know, obviously.
What do you think, Edith? Do you think Mishka's right? Is the argument stronger in the retelling version?
Sorry. Well, part of the problem I'm having is that what we know about her is that she had 5 children and not 13. Her mother had 13, but she didn't. There's a bit of, I don't know, I don't think that the later version is more powerful. And I've got to say, I am very prejudiced against language that he has put in the later version, has put into her mouth. This really uneducated type language where, you know, she must have had a lot of something, because she did speak the 2 languages. And I gather that she was very proud of speaking correct English and knowing the correct way to say things in English, because it wasn't her natural language. So I don't know, I've had a really hard time with this whole thing, and to me it may have sounded more powerful, but just knowing her background, it's not her, it's not true. And it really bothers me.
Yeah, so I guess one question that I have as I've been thinking about this is, what is true? Like, Martha of all of us, right, clearly has a relationship with the 1863 version of the speech. Like, had read that, heard it performed, whatever, before tonight, before engaging with this text. I had read about Sojourner Truth in history book or whatever, but I do not remember encountering the text of the speech. I mean, it's possible that I did have snippets of it in some history textbook, but I don't remember. Certainly, the way that this speech has entered into the American canon is the 1863 version. People imagine Sojourner Truth saying, "Ain't I a woman?" or "Aren't I a woman?" And the repetition of that phrase that points out what today we would call intersectionality, the way in which her Blackness and her womanness is both affects how society views her, right? The white woman is going to be taken care of by society and helped over the mud puddles. But the black woman is just as strong as any man, right? That's the point of the 1863 version. It's a speech that really speaks to intersectionality. It's intersectionality in the way that it means having multiple identities that, when taken together, have a different kind of impact in society than just one of those identities. Black woman is different from black and different from woman. And we can look about how Frederick Douglass was treated in the same time period and how Sojourner Truth was treated in the same time period. And we can say, yeah, black man, formerly a slave, and black woman, formerly a slave, completely different. Nobody would have rewritten Frederick Douglass's words. Frederick Douglass was writing his own words to start out with, but no one would have dared rewrite his words to make him sound like he was from the Deep South and completely uneducated or illiterate in how to speak proper English. And yet the version that contains that powerful sense of intersectionality, which the 1851 version does not have, that version, I think, makes a claim on the way that we think about America that is different from the 1851 version. All she says in the 1851 version is that she can do anything a man can do. Right? That's her main point. Women can do anything a man can do, but there's nothing about being black in that at all. And so I do think that by giving her this dialect and by giving her this line, "Aren't I a woman?" that accentuates the differences between black women and white women.
Yeah.
The abolitionist is retelling her words in a way that actually makes a point that's maybe a more impactful point for American history, even if it is less true. And then we have to ask ourselves, like, what does that do to Sojourner Truth, the woman, right? That we're erasing her actual words and replacing them with words that people imagine might be more impactful. And what does it mean that a white man is doing that to her? And what does it mean for us if that is in fact maybe a more impactful version of the speech in some ways? Martha.
As you're speaking, it just brought something up. The meaning of the story as we've been telling it and as we know it, whether or not it's true in all the detail, does that matter? Somehow it reminded me of the Exodus story and the three different, scholarly theories of the Exodus. Okay, so we all get that in seminary. And, how did it really happen? And, was it the peasant revolt theory, or was it this theory or the other theory? And does that matter? I finally at one point just said, I don't care how it really happened. Did we join an existing Canaanite blah, 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 rebellion? I don't care, because what was clear to me was what's important in Jewish life is the story. We tell the story and the meaning that we make from the story. And that's what I was hearing you talking about. That was very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly it, right? Like when we tell the story of the Exodus, we don't care whether Moses really spoke negatively about his wife, or whether he had a relationship with Pharaoh, right? When you watch the depiction in, the DreamWorks film, The Prince of Egypt, they imagine that Moses's relationship with Pharaoh was like they grew up together as adopted brothers, that they had a deep, deep relationship, and that when Moses has to kill or be the instrument of the death of Pharaoh's son, that's like being the instrument of his own nephew's death. And that there's like a huge emotional impact for Moses on that. And I think that it works in the context of that film because Moses then like is giving a voice to the sadness that we all practice when we spill out the wine with the 10 plagues, when we say our cup of joy can't be fully filled because some people had to die in order for our people to be free, right? When we say that, right, Moses gives voice to that in the context of that film, right? When we tell the story of the Exodus, we don't care what Moses' emotions were. We don't care who Moses actually was. What we care is the way that we tell the story about Moses as a figure who, meets the need that we have. And so that film imposes on Moses a certain kind of familial relationship with Pharaoh, but by doing so, it gives voice to a real truth, which is that there's deep sadness in watching what happened to the Egyptian people. It might be necessary, but it's sad. And Moses, right, what we're doing there in that depiction is we're using the character of Moses, not the real human being Moses, but the character to tell a story, right? And here, because this is an actual person who actually lived, not a character from myth and 4,000 years ago, but an actual person who lived in the late 19th century, in the mid 19th century, where we actually know things about and have a lot of reports of what she was actually like, and we know her real history. Perhaps it's really like terrible that the person was erased by this story. But do we care? Or do we need, as a people, as an American people, do we need this speech as part of the canon? Is it an important part of how we tell the story of abolitionism and the story of women's rights and the story of what it was like to fight the Civil War? And like, does it we're erasing the real human being, Sojourner Truth, when we perpetuate the 1863 version of this speech. But maybe the 1863 version, maybe there's a reason why it's part of our canon, why we need that story. Mishka.
I was struck by the fact that 1863 is the year that the slaves were emancipated. When did this writing of her speech come about? Was it before or after? Was it in some way written out so that people would feel, yes, it is incredibly important that we free our slaves, because this particular woman, especially as a woman, demanded equality. And here we are in the middle of this period of history that requires reading this particular speech. And was it written, presumably some sort of record of the speech in dialect, for whatever you want to say, that made it sound perhaps more real to people around the country, that this actually we are actually talking about a Black woman who had been a slave. And how does the timing of that all come together?
I'm not 100% sure on the timing of, but it vis-a-vis the Emancipation Proclamation, but I don't think that's necessary.
It
right?
may not be at all, but I'm
No, I mean,
curious.
I don't think it's like the war, the Civil War was well underway. Like,
Yep.
and so the context is obviously relevant, regardless of whether the slaves had been freed by proclamation or not.
Right.
Right. And Abraham Lincoln, like the Union Army, was freeing slaves as it went too. Like it wasn't, yes, that then like the Emancipation Proclamation made it legal, but they were already doing it. So anyway, I agree with you. I think that there's right that this was probably very intentionally done by an abolitionist who wanted it to meet the people's imagination of what that person would have sounded like. But if I were her, I'd be really terribly put out that I had been misquoted in this way.
Just another point of information. New York had its anti-slavery law in 1827, and her master would not release her.
And she ran away.
She ran away. She left, which I think is really important to who she is.
Yeah. She wouldn't take no for an answer. She wouldn't take, right? So I do think that some pieces of this speech are better in the more close to the original than in the 1863 version. I think it's clearer in the 1851 version, and this is a good example of it. As for intellect, all I can say is if women have a pint and man a quart, why can't she have her little pint full? You need not be afraid to give us our rights for fear we will take too much, for we can't take more than our pint'll hold. The poor men seem to be all in confusion and don't know what to do. Why, children, if you have women's rights, give it to her and you'll feel better. You will have your own rights and they won't be so much trouble. Right? So that's her point, I think, more closely to what she actually meant.
Who is they? Won't be so much trouble.
They,
right.
The women,
the
annoying women who are trying to.
Right. I just wanted to clarify that.
Organize. Yeah. So the 1863 version says, then they talks about this thing in the head. What does they call it? And then like somebody shouted out, intellect. That's it, honey. What that's got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yourn holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have a little half measure full? So I actually think that her original argument is a little more sophisticated than the version that the 1863 version gives her. It's not about meanness or kindness. It's like in her version, she actually says, one of the reasons why you know that it won't be a bad idea to give us women's rights is that women won't ever be as powerful as men, won't ever be as intellectual as men, won't ever, right? Now, obviously, that's not a point of view that I hold or that we hold in the modern period, but I think her argument is clearer than the argument about just meanness. And then I wonder, like, maybe the abolitionist was uncomfortable with the idea that women's intellect was a pint and men's intellect was a quart. Maybe he was uncomfortable with that image, so he changes it a little bit and makes it about meanness or whatever. But also he makes it so that she, the person, didn't know the word intellect. So it's a complicated story, right? Like, on the one hand, he's trying to make the argument better, or he's trying to shape it up to meet his needs. But on the other hand, he's completely erasing the actual human being.
And it's interesting just what you're saying about erasing the human being. And I sit and I think, and that is such a modern concept around, issues of race and gender. Yeah. I know nobody would be sitting around well, maybe I know some of them, but yeah, like in 150 years ago, the very idea that it would matter if we were erasing, the whole notion of slavery made erasure completely acceptable in that.
Right. So here's a white abolitionist who really has no problem taking the basic bones of a speech and the idea of a speech and using it for his own ends, which he thinks are justified and right and God-given, and like he's doing the Lord's work, and he doesn't care at all that he is completely rewriting Sojourner Truth's actual words, because he's a white man. He can rewrite what the Black woman said, no problem.
Right.
Do we know anything about him?
Well, we know he was he was a very, very prominent abolitionist.
Okay.
So I wonder what his real agenda is. He seems to be in one side, he's saying, aren't I a woman? But at the same time, he's not presenting her as a woman who might be equal to a white woman. And so he's almost emphasizing her.
Yeah.
He's disparaging her. He's saying, yes, I'm physically capable of doing all these things, but I'm not very smart. So, if you only give me a little rights, it is, on the one hand, yeah, fine. Let's do away with slavery, but maybe he's saying, let's keep women down a little bit.
Yeah. One thing that I learned from the Smithsonian article that Edith sent me was that Sojourner Truth was a person who had she was one of these people who had a complete conversion, a born again kind of experience. She was always had a faith in Jesus, but she was a person who then had like a vision of God, and like it completely changed the course of her life. And when she spoke in profoundly religious terms, and like from a deep sense of Christian faith. And we see that in this quote, where her argument, her original argument, the 1851 version, is very based on biblical stories, not our Bible, but the Christian Bible. And the version, the 1863 version, sort of takes a lot of that Bible reading out of it and makes it just about the one point. So let's look at that. I can't read, but I can hear. I have heard the Bible, and I have learned that Eve caused man to sin. Well, if a woman upset the world, do give her a chance to set it right side up again. That's a really powerful statement, if you ask me.
I love it.
I love that. The lady has spoken about Jesus, how he never spurned woman from him, and she was right. When Lazarus died, Mary and Martha came to him with faith and love and besought him to raise their brother, and Jesus wept, and Lazarus came forth. And how came Jesus into the world? Through God who created him and woman who bore him. Man, where is your part? But the women are coming up. Blessed be God, and a few of the men are coming up with them. But man is in a tight place. Poor slave is on him. The woman is coming on him, and he is surely between a hawk and a buzzard. Right? Meaning, it's hard to be a white man, right? Like all these black people are trying to be freed, and the women are trying to have suffrage. It's not easy right now for
white
right?
supremacists. This is what the white supremacists are feeling.
All right. The 1863 version says, "Then that little man there in black there, he say women can't have as much rights as man because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all on her one alone, all these together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And nowadays asking to, the men better let him." So I think there's right, the main thrust there is the same, but the presentation is really very different.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think the examples that she brings of women who are in relationship with Jesus, like, really comes from her deep faith, and like that's very removed in the 1863 version. I wonder if, the language of faith that she used was uncomfortable for the abolitionist, or whether he wanted to make it palatable to other folks. I don't know.
I was just seeing that last question from where we had been, no, I guess a little bit further, talking about the use of religion to discuss women's rights, and we have that all over the place in the Muslim world, and we have it all over the place in our own world of more small c conservative folk. Women's rights and using religion to excuse it, allow it, whatever the words are. I don't know.
Yeah, certainly as a rabbi, I think that using theology and religion are very, very, very important part of how I speak about this. When I say, I've said this before, so I don't think it's a surprise to anyone, but I don't count myself in a quorum, in a minyan that doesn't count women.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that God's infinity is better expressed through the divine reflection of adult Jews of all genders. And I think that it is mima'it et hadmut. It diminishes the image of God in the world not to count adult Jews of all genders in the minyan. I think it is. So I use profoundly theological explanation for my political or social or moral stance.
And other people use their beliefs for somewhat different outcomes.
Right. Well, that's part of why I do it. I sort of feel like I feel like it doesn't hurt to have a maximalist approach. Like if when I go into pluralistic spaces, everybody sort of feels let's go to the rightmost common denominator because well, the Orthodox they won't pray except if there's a mechitza. But most conservative Jews will, will if they have to, they'll pray wherever wherever there's a minyan. But I express it specifically because of that, because I think my religious claim is just as valid as an Orthodox person's claim. And I think I should be able to describe my claim in as strong a language. So I'm for using theology. Of course, Christian theology doesn't do much for me. But I respect it as a person who loves and cares about many Christians who deeply value their theological approach.
But there are many people whose theological approach steps on other people's toes. And that included slavery. Those who justified it, well, there are slaves in the Bible, there's slaves in the Torah.
Yeah. And not just slaves in the Bible and slaves in the Torah, but the black people in particular deserve to be slaves because Noah cursed his grandson Canaan and his son Ham, who went and raped Noah while he was in a drunken stupor. And like that is a traditional approach to why black people are deserving of slavery.
I did not know that.
Oh yeah. Comes from the Bible.
Yeah, but the question of the sons being black.
Yes, that's obviously not necessarily evident in the text, but that is the interpretation.
Okay.
So Francis Gage, the abolitionist, he admitted that he amended her speech. Sorry, that she amended her speech. But really believed that the version that version is stronger and better and more palatable to the American public than the original version. So, like, Gage knew that that was changing it. Here's what the Sojourner Truth Project says, sort of going to what we were talking about myth. Sojourner Truth exists today in many forms, as a person, as a symbol, and as a myth. The preference for the Gage version of truth speech speaks to our nation's need for symbolism in our historical narrative. The speech became impactful not only because of its words, but also because of the way Gage conveyed it. However, to see Sojourner only through this lens is to oversimplify her identity and to minimize her real-life struggles and hard-won human accomplishments. It is important to see her as a real person who, despite starting life enslaved, rose up and fought tirelessly with incredible conviction, faith, and courage for human rights and personal freedoms. So we're about to close. We're reaching the end of our time. I want to remind everybody that we're going to be back in just a few weeks on April 18th to do Ursula K. Le Guin's story, The Ones Who Walked Away from Omelas. But I want to close with this last question about that, like, sort of brings this into some contemporary context. In the 2008 Democratic primary, Joe Biden received criticism for calling Barack Obama articulate because the comment implies surprise that an African American man can speak using normative patterns. Black Americans, people of color, and women often code switch to navigate between different groups while simultaneously facing criticism for not behaving according to the expectations of their social group. For another example, see the likability bias for women. Is it fair to expect all groups in society to speak in the same way? And how often do we notice when we have judged someone on the basis of their speech patterns or accents?
All the time.
Yep. I was talking to a friend of mine in Texas. I mean, I grew up in the North. She grew up in the South. She's white. We're both white, well-educated. And we both just like really admitted to each other. I said, you know, take the person with the same exact background, education, looks, hairstyling, clothing. I said, one of them speaks standard white English and one of them does not. I said, right away, I'm sorting the one who does not into a really different, you know, set of social locations and assumptions, just no matter what. It's instant. I don't know. And I came from a family personally that was deeply biased against speaking what my great-grandfather called bastardized English. So he insisted on his children speaking Yiddish only at home, which he could speak, and to learn English, proper English, in the school because he didn't want them speaking bastardized English. So anyway.
That was exactly my experience. My parents were German. They wouldn't let me speak English at home. They wanted me only to speak English in school and with other English-speaking kids. But what's interesting, I had a career in radio, and when this started a long time ago, we were all supposed to have standard English in the same way that the British who worked for BBC all had to speak standard Queen's English. And that has changed. And it's very interesting, especially if you listen to NPR. You have people from all over, and the names give you clearly a sense of where this person might be coming from. And you listen for the accent. Well, is there an accent? Well, yeah, there's an accent maybe, but where are they from? And all kinds of questions come up like that. So that's changed because the assumption was that everybody had to speak with the same accentless accent. And since I come from New York and I don't talk like a New Yorker, I was always people were very happy to have me work for them. Barbie's making a face.
Barbie, did you have something you wanted to say?
What did you say, Rabbi?
Did you have something you wanted to add?
No, I make faces. That's me.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for being here. And I sent out earlier today the link to the survey. If you can take a couple minutes and fill that out, that would be great. And we'll hopefully see you next month for our final session of this series.
Rabbi, did you send out the source material for next time?
There isn't as much source material for the next one. There wasn't a participant worksheet. There was just the facilitator's worksheet. So there isn't a lot. I will send out a link to the short story so that you can read it before.
Yeah. That's good.
But it's not a long short story. It's only 4.5 or 5 pages. It's like a short story. Maybe it's as long as 6 or 7 pages. Anyway, I'm going to read it out loud at the beginning of our next session. So if you don't read it, you'll still get to participate in the conversation because you'll get to hear me read it. And my reading voice isn't quite as good maybe as Mishka's, but I think it's okay.
It's fine. You'd pass. You'd pass.
But for those of us who have problems absorbing
yes.
things by
I'll definitely
orally.
send it out.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank
please.
you.
Yeah, that would be good. That would be good.
Very good.
Okay, thank you.
Good
Thank you.
evening.
Lots to think about.